Hello and welcome to the Future Food Finance Podcast. My name is David Stevenson.
And my name is Paul Cuatrecasas.
And we're the founders of Future Food Finance. We've been away for a couple of weeks. We've both been trying to grab holidays a bit earlier before the mad rush. So we haven't had our podcast for probably about a month now. We're back to our normal once every couple of weeks routine, where we talk about a couple of stories just we've seen in the press over the last couple of weeks that are interesting, and then pick on a big story. The big story we're going to pick on is how governments and markets interact when it comes to climate change, farming, and that kind of stuff, because that's been in the news a lot at the moment, particularly Sri Lanka, but particularly in Netherlands, where if you're in the UK, you probably haven't read much about this, but there's been massive protests in the Netherlands from their farmers around cutting contributions to climate change and fertilizers. But we'll come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, I just thought I had two stories that picked up on. One of which I know is close to your heart, Paul, is there's a lot more coverage of vertical farming. I get the real sense that vertical farming is now becoming really mainstream in its coverage. It's been a fantastic FT article. There's recently a great Wall Street Journal article. A lot of all the mainstream press is covering it now, mainly because these big sheds are beginning to come online and produce is emerging in the market in supermarkets. And I think that vertical farming now is becoming as mainstream as probably alternative proteins were probably a couple of years ago, where if you probably ask people, plant-based proteins where they were about 3-4 years ago, only a small minority would know. And I think that vertical farming's there now. But I think the really interesting challenge is going to be around energy efficiency, because it's clear that everything works. You can get the produce out. It's at a decent price, a bit more of a premium. It's in the supermarket. So that's all working. And the challenge in vertical farming seems to be energy efficiency, about getting those LED displays working, making sure that you cut down energy usage, because obviously they have much more energy usage there going on. And that strikes me as a fascinating challenge, because many of the problems facing alternative proteins have been kind of bioengineering or biomechanical, using technology. And that cycle of innovation seems to take a lot longer. Whereas when it comes to kind of like hard engineering questions, solar power, for instance, pack as many solar cells, photovoltaic cells on a sheet and get it out the factory. Wind turbines, getting wind turbines with the right materials, cheaper, more efficient, more energy efficient. The cost curves come down remarkable on that very fast. And if the challenge for vertical farming is effectively a hard engineering challenge, then that I think is really interesting, because I think that you could see real speed pick up there as people begin to pack ever more LED units, find cleverer ways to get energy efficiency going. And I think that if they could crack the energy efficiency nut and reduce their energy inputs drastically and use renewables, then I think this could really be quite a huge thing. It's also relevant, I said, about the pace of change. We've talked in the past around sort of cell-grown meat. It's years before it will become mainstream, apart from maybe fish-based alternatives, because there's lots of bioengineering, biotech, and biomechanical issues. But I think that vertical farming is, I think, really one to watch. What's your take, Paul?
Yeah. So, just to comment, I'm not an expert in vertical farming, but I know something about it, and I love vertical farming. I think it's a great concept that is now being built out with billions of dollars. And like most things that start out small, that end up attracting quite a lot of capital across a broad spectrum of companies and geographies and regions, it's just a matter of time before it takes off. But let's be clear, vertical farming is very expensive. Very expensive. Electricity costs, energy costs, LED lighting today, it's not economical. It doesn't serve a broad population in any way, except for when we get to the point of cost-efficient vertical farms. You can imagine local vertical farms, regional vertical farms that serve a local population. That gets quite interesting, but that's way out. We need, I think, in my own mind, what are the two critical factors from an 80-20 point of view? We need LED lighting, which is the one of the prime costs that vertical farms have in their P&L. That LED lighting cost has to come way down, and it will. It is coming down, according to Moore's law, effectively, and exponential technology. So that will come down. And the cost of energy is also coming down. And it may be more some new forms of energy, renewable energy, rather than the ones we're thinking of, traditionally windmills or offshore windmills and solar and the like. There's a new energy form that's just starting to gain more attention called wave energy conversion, which has been around for years, but it's no one's really figured it out yet. But it is coming. It will be figured out. It will be possibly more efficient than any other form of energy production that's renewable at the moment. And so that's just another example of technology finding a way always, and ultimately becoming an exponential force in terms of the value per cost. So I think the way to think about vertical farming is not expecting dividends. Again, thinking if you're an investor the next year or two, that's not going to happen. But if you're able to take a long-term view, and in this sense, I'm thinking 7, 8, 9 years, and you can just close your eyes and hold, and take a portfolio approach. So probably not the best idea of vertical farming today to pick one company if you're a private investor and to bet on that, because there are a lot of things that can happen to any one single company. But if you could put together a portfolio, if that were possible, practically a portfolio of 10 or 20 interesting, different types of vertical farming operations, and possibly also including some picks and shovels companies, not just the actual farm itself, then I think you could have an extremely interesting portfolio. Again, as long as you are cautious on the entry price, because price is what you pay, value is what you get. So as we're coming off the market highs over the last couple of years now, and I think we're going to be continuing down if not into a flattening market, private markets that is, if not declining, then it's a great time to be thinking over the next 6 to 12 months how to accumulate positions in vertical farming operations at the right price, that you can, again, just close your eyes and hold for the next 5-10 years. Could be very interesting.
And on a regional note, the one area actually I think is fascinating is actually look at the Middle East and vertical farms. That's potentially fascinating area because there's no absence of capital, in the Middle East, so the big city states.
You saw the news, David, a couple of days ago. I forget which country in the Middle East just announced the largest vertical farm in the world.
No absence of energy, no absence of solar energy, and a captive market that wants fresh produce is probably willing to pay for it. So paradoxically, sometimes look regionally. Talking of geography, the other thing which I caught my eye, which will lead us on to what we want to mainly talk about, is poor old alternative proteins, plant-based alternatives, and kind of cell-grown alternatives. It's been a bit of a backlash. Loads of stories about, but every week or two, something like Beyond Meat ends up in the newspaper. Another story sort of busily having a go at it. And it's going through its purple patch, I think is fair to say. Lots of pushback going on. And one of the most interesting bits of pushback that's going on is the use of terminology. And now it appears that even the Turkish government is muscling in on the act and is basically suggesting bringing in rules whereby if you have plant-based cheese alternatives, you can't call them cheese. We've already seen the French push back on the use of meat, so have the South Africans. And what that's telling us is, paradoxically, governments are becoming much more interested in the whole food tech arena. And most people tend to assume that if governments become interested in an innovative area, it's for the good. And this just reminds us that actually it doesn't always work that way. When you run into entrenched interests, particularly the farming lobby and the meat lobby, who probably have a big issue with this space and are busy lobbying some governments, government can work to the negative. Which leads me to the main topic I'll talk about, Paul, which I don't know if you've been seeing. There's been loads of stuff around these farmer revolts in the Netherlands, where, to cut to the chase of it, the Netherlands, highly industrialized agricultural sector, small country, flat land, unsurprisingly, and plenty of fertilizers being used to have very high levels of productivity. So the Dutch farmers are very, very efficient. But one of the reasons they're efficient is that they use a lot of fertilizers, and there's a big issue to do with runoff and nitrogen. It affects the water supply, affects the environment, and there's been a push for quite some time amongst some of the more kind of green-inspired liberal and centrist parties in Netherlands to change the nature of farming, to have less use of fertilizers, and to cut down on the use of animals within farming. And they brought in various regulations that were supposed to be coming in 2030. And basically, without beating around the bush, it's gone completely AWOL. Farmers are up in arms because effectively they're going to be put out of business. And there's been a real pushback. And they've even the echoes in other countries, because, of course, what the Dutch do first, probably the European Union will do next. And if you're a farmer in, I don't know, Hungary, Poland, even France, you can see the way the wind is blowing. And the core thing I want to get at here, which is that this is a classic example of how not to manage technological innovation and government policy. If you basically have a kind of, I call it kind of a Bolshevik approach, which is, you have your urban metropolitan elite bureaucrats turning up in their electric powered Volvo cars and telling people in rural areas, well, we're actually going to put you out of business because of this rule we're going to bring in. It doesn't go down very well, just as the Bolshevik plan to eliminate the Kulaks didn't go down terribly well. What you really, really need, and this is what I think a lot of green activists sort of fail to understand, is that you need two things, really. One is you need to provide for the people who are going to have their industry shut down. So in the olden days, it was coal mining and steel because in free trade. In the modern era, it's probably farming. You need to provide them with an alternative now. Yeah, it's no good saying, well, we'll come up with an alternative in the next 5 or 10 years. If you can't basically make it work now, people won't go for it. It's the same reason that people are very, very suspicious in the home heating space, in the green agenda, around these heat air exchangers. Everybody's got to get off natural gas, and we're going to move on to these heat exchangers. The problem is, bar a few innovative companies like Octopus, the economics don't stack up, and therefore people are just going, well, I'm not going to do it. It's just way more expensive, and I'm not going to make any money out of it. So if you don't provide people with an alternative now, it won't work. And then the second thing I just want to emphasize is a lot of Greens particularly are very worried about market incentives, and they think the market's not the right way to go with innovation. Well, I'm afraid it is, though, because the Dutch example is the perfect example. If you do a diktat and you don't build market-based incentives in, and then slowly ramp the market-based incentives up over time, so put prices on carbon, put prices on emissions from fertilizers, so maybe increase their price gradually over time, maybe bring in market incentives around pollution so that farmers don't have as much pollution, and you slowly bring it in, and you do it by agreement, and you do it by mutual understanding, but you use the market to bring in the change in behavior. If you don't do that, then people will just simply refuse to change. They just won't do it. And the Dutch example is a perfect example. If that had been built around a market-based framework where you give incentives and you allow people a time to move along, not this idea that we must stop now and put you all out of business. If you don't use that market-based approach, a lot of the changes that we talk about in the food tech era won't happen. They just simply won't happen. And this is a prime example. And if you want a perfect example of how it goes terribly wrong, you just have to go to Sri Lanka, where they brought in this rule about putting large amounts of organic farming in pretty much overnight and not using fertilizers and going for a more regenerative approach. And by the way, I think regenerative farming is a brilliant idea, and we should be encouraging it. But don't do it by diktat, because they did it by diktat in Sri Lanka, and for that and many other reasons, the country went bust, basically, because they had to import rice, because agricultural production went down. They didn't have the foreign currency to import rice. It's not the only reason Sri Lanka got in a mess, but it is a major contributory factor. So I just want to emphasize, a lot of the things we talk about in food tech are involving deep structural change. But if you don't use the right mechanism to introduce change, it'll go catastrophically wrong.
David, I would just comment on that. I'm not sure there is a right way when it comes to disruption and things that are new to the planet. And what I mean by that is, in the Netherlands, for example, where this is happening, there are several interesting companies that have developed an alternative to animal meat.
Yeah.
So it's the home of Mosa Meat and Professor Post, who designed the first $250,000 meat, lab meat hamburger, but which today is an interesting, viable company that's raised over $100 million. The last round closed, I think, earlier this year, $85 million. And that company has a lot of promise. And just announced yesterday, I think, there was another Dutch company, which only came out of stealth about 3 years ago, called Meatable, which announced lab-grown pork sausages, which uses a new way. And this is from a single cell. And apparently it tastes exactly like the real thing, even better. It sizzles in the frying pan. So the Netherlands has, just with these two companies, companies that are among the leaders in the world in developing a replacement for the animals that are in these intensive animal farms in the Netherlands, which have been claimed by experts to be producing nearly half of the country's nitrogen pollution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, look, this is how disruption starts. And I don't know what the riots would have looked like back in, 1910, when automobiles were starting to emerge and the horse and cart companies would have been outraged that someone is trying to use technology to do away with these beautiful, amazing horses and carts that could go up and down hills and didn't break down because of parts and so on. There was probably all kinds of outrage. But one thing was clear, was that you're not going to stop technology. And I think this is just the beginning of what is inevitable. I can't comment on the government and the powers that be. I mean, there are 8 large agri players in the Netherlands. Clearly, they have influence. And I'm sure they're not unhappy about some of the smaller local independent farmers going out on the streets and protesting. But at the end of the day, you can only fight science so much. Unless governments completely step in and put a ban on things. But in the Netherlands, that's probably not going to happen, just for a couple of the reasons that I mentioned. This is inevitability. So I think from an investor point of view, it's simply to sit back and observe. This is kind of a natural consequence of genuine, fundamental disruption to one of the most basic industries that humankind has ever known, agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. You can't stop innovation. And I think that the most interesting area, well, I suppose you just do it in a kind of, Bolshevik way and say, we're not going to have any innovation. But I don't think that's probably an option. I think where I worry most is where governments mandate stuff where the technology hasn't caught up with. Yeah. That's, I think, is the problem. And there, I think, lurks the
isn't that mandate for 7 years from now?
Sorry?
So how is it different from the mandate for electric vehicles? I think in the UK there was something similar. I forget.
Oh, yeah, but the difference is that that's about selling new vehicles. Yeah. So you could probably still be driving around in your own diesel-powered jalopy in the mid 2030s. Yeah.
But to what extent has that directive? And I mean, I don't have the answer. It's just an interesting question.
Yeah.
To what extent has that directive caused demand to
absolutely
increase naturally?
Yeah, but it has. So,
I think there's an interesting question about perception and subconscious being driven by headlines and.
But I think absolutely, that's why I think that the electric car transformation is the ideal transformation, because what they've done is they've built incentives in there. Yeah. So, in the UK, until very recently, you got a lot of money for the government to be able to do stuff. The government has gone out of its way to build an infrastructure to allow you to operate the electric cars. The government has also, bit by bit, loaded the dice against hydrocarbons by the fuel tax going up, and not out by energy prices rising. So what the government has done is the government has tilted the playing field towards one direction, aided by technology and innovation. And that, I think, that's my point. I think that's a better way of doing things. I think if you give mandatory deadlines where effectively your industry will go bust.
Don't forget, in the automotive industry, there's been the benefit of this company called Tesla,
Yeah.
And Tesla started producing cars that people wanted. They wanted so bad they would pay deposits 2 or 3 years before the company was even launched. So unlike the auto industry that had the benefit of Tesla, in the meat industry, in the animal farming industry, there is no lab meat that people can go to the store and buy.
No.
So I think, look, and I'm not saying that is the reason for what's going on in the Netherlands. I mean, I don't know that much about it. All I'm commenting on is the forces of disruption cause all kinds of things to happen that people wouldn't necessarily predict. And by the way, are difficult to plan. It's difficult for the government or any other body to be able to plan what to do when it comes to science that's evolving at the pace it's evolving. I can tell you 3 or 4 years ago, when I was talking quite a lot about lab meat, nobody was interested. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Meatable hadn't even been. I remember the day that Meatable in the Netherlands first announced its presence on the earth. Oh, we've figured out a way to grow hamburger meat from a single cell of a cow. Well, a few others had claimed to do something similar. This is without using fetal bovine serum and the like. And ever since then, the industry's taken off like a rocket, which has also caused, of course, counter arguments like the one that we read about recently in the Counter magazine. So it's just disruption. It's a natural cause of disruption that's coming that is big and is going to affect certain countries like the Netherlands in a major way. And this is it's just the beginning. It's a wake up call. It's a wake up.
On the practical note, just to finish off with, the two areas that I think to watch out for from an investment perspective is biological alternatives to fertilizers. I think that's a big area of innovation. There's lots of stuff happening in that area. And that there are lots of people trying to figure out a way of not having that nitrogen runoff problem by using biologicals. So that's a big area to watch out for. And I think you also see some really interesting stuff around regenerative farming, where people are trying to use technology more with regenerative farming, including kind of capturing carbon as well in the mix, so that farmers can make as much money out of regenerative farming and carbon capture as they can out of traditional industrial style agriculture. So, and I've noticed a lot of very clever people beginning to move around regenerative farming now, which has always been kicking around, but it's never really been scalable. And we're starting to see some quite interesting innovation in that space. So that and biological fertilizers, definitely one to watch out for.
Completely
in the
agree.
meantime, that's it for now. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening and watching, and stay safe.